keeping our focus a bit on the legislature, and a topic that we heard Senator Springer remark on is the American Recovery Plan Act funding. And we have asked Carlos Rubinstein, he is a principal with the firm RSA H2O, an environmental consulting firm, to join us and talk a little bit about the possibilities for water with those $17 billion. Carlos is a former chairman of the Texas Water Development Board, has also held a number of leadership roles at the TCEQ and a number of other organizations. His full bio, as well as everyone else's, is in the program and in the app. So I'll welcome Carlos up to the stage.
Thank you, Leah. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the American Recovery Plan. Leah called about, I don't know, what was it, about a week and a half ago? To see if this event occurred, and again, congratulations for putting on such a great event that allows us all to finally see each other face to face. It's pretty cool. But she asked if I could fill in, if need be, because of cancellations, to talk about ARPA, and I told her I would. It didn't strike me then that the timing would be that I would be a filler just before lunch. So that's okay, I'll go with that. But again, congratulations on putting on a great event. I look forward to having a discussion with you that hopefully gets us thinking about ARPA a little bit broader, and that we don't allow the opportunities that could be in ARPA to pass us by, thinking that we're better off waiting for the next stimulus bill or the next infrastructure bill. The reality is that there are opportunities there that we should look into, and I think it would help advance some of the issues that we've already heard about yesterday and today about how is it that we provide for better data? How is it that we advance our projects to become more resilient in Texas? So with that, let's jump in a little bit into this. During the last stimulus, one of the last stimulus bills, the American Recovery Plan Act, was included as part of a broader one. It's easy to read it incorrectly and think that this is not for us in water. It is also easy to not pay a lot of attention to, and I think those would be to our detriment. There is a substantial amount of money there. Yes, it is COVID related, because COVID is what is causing all of these stimulus bills to be advanced. But it does have a water component with a lot of flexibility that we'll explore here in the next few slides. There's about $350 billion that has been allocated to states and local governments and territories, again, with lots of flexibility. You see how it's broken down. The states and the District of Columbia are going to share about $195 billion. Counties have already gotten about $65 billion. Cities have gotten about 45.6, and then you see the other breakdown. So the question is, how much is Texas getting, and in what buckets is it going? Buckets we'll explore a little bit later. The comments that I'm sharing with you today in this presentation really apply to the funding that's gone to the state or can be eligible for the state government. For Texas, it's about $16.8 billion. For the cities themselves, as a direct allocation, $3.37 billion, or for the counties. So as you think more broadly about ARPA, think about these three buckets, not just focused on one. In total, Texas is getting about $27.3 billion. That is a substantial amount of stimulus funding. Half of it has already been allocated. The other half is expected to be allocated by May of next year. What is it that qualifies under ARPA? Well, of course, this is a COVID-related stimulus bill, and as you would expect, public health is high on the list. But it's also recognizing that because of COVID, we have had some serious economic impacts, and it is about also job creation. If you read ARPA, it keeps saying, let's build back stronger. And I'm glad that there's a recognition that water is critical to be able to build it back stronger. And as you can see with the blue arrow, water and sewer infrastructure is a qualified expenditure under ARPA. If you just read this information sheet, you're going to say, well, maybe that's not for me. One of the things that worries me is that when we talk about funding for infrastructure, we immediately think that's too high level, too big. How can it fund the needs that we have here? We'll be exploring some ways that I think ARPA actually fits that goal very well for us. But here, as it says, it is to make necessary investments to improve access to clean water and wastewater and invest in those kinds of infrastructure. Let's dig a little deeper. This includes obviously the improvements of the infrastructure, building and upgrading facilities, conveyance systems, distribution system, or storage systems. One of the things that I think folks may read incorrectly in ARPA is that it makes a direct reference to the state revolving fund programs that the federal government funds, the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF. And one of the things that I remember when I was on the board is some of the negative connotations that come with SRF, the federal cross-cutters that apply. And that may serve as to disincentivize us looking at them. I'm here to tell you that we ought to look at ARPA a little bit closer because those I don't read would apply. So where do we go for some guidance on ARPA itself? There's actually a tremendous amount of data out there, and it's actually very, very good and comprehensive. There has been an interim final rule that's already been issued. Comments have been accepted on it. I'll go over a couple of those comments. As I mentioned, it does make reference to the type of projects that you would typically see under the SRFs. It does not mean, though, that the funding will flow for water through an SRF program. And I think because of that, it merits us looking more closely at how we could advance water projects and meet some of our needs through the ARPA itself. One of the things that is several of us reading, and I see Vanessa in the audience, one of the things that we key on is where is it that we can hang our hat on to make a claim that our projects, our needs, our interests would be eligible under ARPA. And it is because it specifically calls out for projects that improve resiliency in being able to meet extreme weather conditions and, yes, climate change. So you're going to hear resiliency a lot in my presentation. It is intended that way because that is, I think, a key of how we get access to some of this funding. You cannot have funding programs without deadlines. This is a recovery plan. It is intended to have a quick impact. And because of that, the money, as I told you, is available now. And the other half of the tranche will be available by May of next year. All of it has to be obligated by December of 2024. It doesn't have to be spent by then, but it has to be obligated by then. Projects do need to be completed by 2026. It is important to see that it is retroactive. So we've had expenditure on some desired projects that will go over some ideas that we have for you to consider. And those costs were incurred or have been incurred starting March of the 3rd of this year. Those would be eligible for reimbursement or coverage. So keep that in mind as well. Flexibility, we think, is key to why we need to take a deep look at ARPA. It is written everywhere that we've looked at, and it stresses that they're leaving the decision on how the money is to be spent to meet the greatest needs to the local governments, to the state and local governments. And remember I mentioned those three buckets, the amount that's going to the state, the amount that's going to the counties, the amount that's going to cities. They have the say-so of how the money could be spent. And again, as long as you meet some of those 6 criteria that they focused on, one of them being water, we would be in good shape. Another thing that I think is interesting for us in Texas, and particularly those of us who have been involved in water, is that ARPA also calls out investment to assist unserved, underserved, disadvantaged communities. We have a great program in the state of Texas that assists with that. We have greater need that could be assisted also through ARPA, and particularly in rural areas. So keep that in mind. So again, because there's that flexibility, there are no federal cross-cutters that I've identified that would be as a disincentive to look at ARPA. Now let's just think more broadly on how we could make a case, or where we should focus on making a case that some of this funding, it'd be great if we got all of this funding towards water, but some of this funding should be looked at to meet some of the needs and demands that you all know you have, particularly because some of them are not large-scale costs, large infrastructure, billion-dollar infrastructure, but they are real pressing needs that keep us from meeting our future demands for water in a better way. I mentioned earlier that the interim rule had already been issued. and comments were accepted. On it, the Water Development Board submitted an exceptional letter to it. I would welcome you all to get a copy of it. I have just a couple of excerpts out of that letter here for you to look at. By no means does it capture the entire essence. And again, I congratulate the board for having submitted those comments. They did call for even greater flexibility in ARPA and water infrastructure to make sure that it would apply for any project that would strengthen our resiliency to both our water and wastewater system, that would help us and restore and protect natural habitats that are dependent on clean water, that would help us in mitigating the threats to life and property because of the droughts or floods that Texas clearly has experienced before, that it would help us in developing long-term water supplies, which are necessary for communities to prepare for extreme and sustained drought conditions. We know that those needs are there, and we also know that the needs and the demands for some of our water exceed the available funding that we are accustomed to today. So ARPA could be yet another bucket where we could go to meet some of these demands. It does allow for expenditures in flood control, flood mitigation, and stormwater. Again, this doesn't capture the entire essence of the Water Development Board's comments, but I would welcome you to get a copy of it and read it. I think it'll make you think more broadly about how ARPA could be utilized. There was a lot of comments, and I'm not going to read all three that are on this slide, but comments that were focused on clarifying the references to the SRF. We know that the SRF, the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, already provide, in part, the ability to be able to add resiliency to our water supply. There's no need to duplicate that, but let's build on that by adding greater flexibility to ARPA. Let's also capture some of the projects that all of us feel are desirable. How is it that we can better conserve and reuse our water supplies? This is included, in part, in the comments that you see on this slide. Let me see. Did I move it right? Yeah. We again highlighted the need within comments that the rule itself should not be interpreted that the same criteria that makes you eligible for an SRF project would apply to ARPA. It does not. And so I think that was critical. Again, I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. And I know firsthand what it is to be able to recognize and try to address the needs of underserved communities. And I also recognize the great work that we've done in the state through the EDAP, the Economically Distressed Areas Program, that there's still a greater need for that. And because ARPA is focused on these disadvantaged communities as well, you look back at what occurred during the last session when EDAP had to be reauthorized. We all know that they've pumped in a lot of money through EDAP for decades. There's so much more need that it exceeds even the capacity of EDAP today. It would be great to meet some of those needs through ARPA funding. And you might think, well, I don't have a colonia that needs this kind of activity. Look at what makes your county eligible for EDAP. Because I think if your county is eligible for EDAP, you can make a great case that disadvantaged communities in rural areas, rural needs could also qualify under this bucket as well. And the last term or the last comment that I think was very critical is let's not get hung up in infrastructure being bricks and mortar. Infrastructure is much more than that. So let's look a little bit into how we can add flexibility in how we interpret ARPA and how then we can identify how we could use it to meet some of our demands. Again, as I mentioned, infrastructure is not just bricks and mortar. It is also, and it should also include data. We've heard a lot in all the presentations that we've heard yesterday and today that better data leads to better science and better decisions. We all agree with that. That is critical also in determining how we're going to be able to advance some of our projects. So the collection, management, and analysis of the data and how it impacts our modeling certainly we could make a claim that is an eligible expenditure over ARPA. And we all discussed yesterday and today the needs to enhance our models. ARPA could be a vehicle for that. As it relates to groundwater, and I wish I could tell you I came up with this one. I did not. I actually heard it from a good friend of mine. An aquifer is infrastructure. It is a reservoir, and it is a conveyance system. So let's look at how some of those needs could tie into meeting some of our demands for water as it relates to groundwater. When I served as a water master in the Rio Grande, I understood that better data to better manage our reservoirs was critical to ensuring the correct way of utilizing that water, adding sustainability to it and resiliency. That is another thing where I think ARPA could be eligible for funding as well. And let's bring it down to even a lower level as it relates to total dollars, not in importance. Expenditures on ARPA to enhance our ability to increase stream gauges, weather stations, groundwater recorder wells could add to our resiliency as well. I would welcome you all to think at this level and not let ARPA go by without making a claim for some of that funding. We all understand that, and we heard it's critical to the Texas-New Mexico case. It's critical to discussions that we've had by panelists here today and yesterday. We need to have a better understanding of groundwater, surface water interaction and a better way to quantify it. That speaks to resiliency. It speaks to resiliency both in groundwater and surface water, and funding those understandings and the models that are needed to get to that granular level, I think would be a good place to make a claim under ARPA for some of those funds as well. ARPA makes a case for diversification in our water portfolio, and so here we should be thinking about desalination, ASR, and also water reuse. Why is it that we could not think under ARPA to help fund resiliency and conserve water by funding market-based solutions that protect groundwater while at the same time monetizing that investment for the groundwater holder? If that market-based solution is not quintessential for the protection of property rights to water, I don't know what is. It speaks to resiliency, it speaks to sustainability, and allows you to monetize that property right for which you already have. Lastly, ARPA makes a case that projects that would call for water quality protection should be looked at. Well, in this case, we all know that throughout Texas, we have problem with abandoned wells. How about developing a project to cap those wells utilizing ARPA funds, or utilization for water quality protection and enhancement, land conservation projects? Again, things to consider because of the flexibility that is allowed under ARPA. We don't have to stop there. Sorry, I think there was somebody wanted to take a picture of the previous slide. I'm gonna let them do that. You're good? Okay, next one. Just letting you know I'm paying attention, it's all good. We know that we talked a lot again about data, and we've all recognized that we don't have enough data. We probably never will. We always want more and better data, and we know that it informs our models. When I served as commissioner at TCEQ, Brian Shaw, who's our chairman, and I still consider him one of the best chairmen the commission's had a great saying. He applied it to air quality models, but I think he really intended it for all. All models are wrong. Some of them may be useful. Well, we also know, and a good friend of mine suggested that we actually add to this phrase, better data could make the models less wrong, and if the models are less wrong, they might be more useful. Why not invest in those kind of activities? We do know one thing, the uncertainty in the models and the lack of trust in some of the data doesn't add to resiliency, it adds to conflict. And the more that we move towards resiliency, the better we all will be served. So let's look at ways to utilize this money to advance projects that call for better data collection, which will lead to more resiliency. As it has been said, and it is true, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it, and if you cannot manage it, you cannot improve it. Again, we know and recognize that within Texas, we have made great strides in how we have developed models to manage our groundwater. But we also know that it's not all fully integrated. The fact that we're still talking about groundwater, surface water interaction and quantification, the fact that we're still having concerns about how the criteria that is already enumerated in Chapter 36 for consideration of DFCs are still a point of contention means to me that there's still room for improvement here. And I think ARPA could be a great source of that funding to be able to identify it. And particularly, I have a couple of them bolded, but I'm going to key in on the third bullet of the first set. I think that we need to have a process and funding that allows us to quantify the socioeconomic impacts and the changing water conditions at a more granular level, at a more local level. How is it that it's actually impacting economically and water-wise our well owners that are out there? Not at the regional perspective, but bring it down even to a more local level. I think that would be a good expenditure of ARPA funds. What you see here, and if you follow it all, I think you're gonna get dizzy. It really is a depiction of how the DFC adoption process is supposed to work, and how it impacts our MAG, and how that then impacts regional water planning. If you're looking at the shaded boxes, those that appear in orange are the Water Development Board. The lavender or purple, whatever color that is to you, that's the GMA. The light tan is the GCD. You see the lines, those are our policy issues. You'll notice about 7 boxes that are outlined in red. Here's where investment through ARPA or other funding in better data could enhance this entire process. Again, the consideration of the criteria that's in Chapter 36, better informed science, better informed modeling, better discussions for DFCs, more robust and thorough explanatory reports, better groundwater models, better modeled available groundwater, all of it feeding into better regional water planning. This is the payoff of having the proper level of investment in getting better data and better modeling, and I think ARPA, certainly because of resiliency, we can make a case that funding should be allowed there. Couple of 4 guiding principles that I would leave you or recommend that you keep in mind while you're thinking about ARPA. We have, and I know this firsthand, we have a model as a state when it comes to available planning and available funding through the Water Development Board. We know that it is highly attractive, very competitive. Some of the programs are oversubscribed. That just speaks to our need. But they are by far, low-interest loans. And we know that through ARPA, the ability to have this kind of funding as grants will be of greater impact in meeting our demands for better modeling, better data, and advancing these resiliency-type projects. So we would recommend, again, that ARPA continue to be intended as a grant and not a loan. We know that our environment of water in Texas is changing. The state is changing. The way we manage water has to continue to evolve with that change. So again, we need to be able to be nimble in that regard. When it comes to water resiliency, we all know and have seen firsthand the impacts of floods and droughts in Texas. And as we all have talked and heard in previous panels, February added a new dynamic as an extreme. That freeze event certainly taught us something that's a little bit more different. So as we look at resiliency and the ability to plan on how to respond to these events, certainly that is a case for funding from ARPA could be of assistance. And then again, to close with a topic that I think you all know is important to me, and I know it's important to the chairwoman as well, is the disadvantaged communities. Again, let's not lose focus on that. We have made great strides in improving water conditions for those communities, but the demand for additional work remains. We still have Texans today without access to clean water or wastewater treatment facilities. We should do better. ARPA can be utilized for that kind of an activity. So in summary, again, to stress a couple of points, water and wastewater projects are specifically eligible under ARPA. There is a time constraint, keep that in mind. It is all about flexibility and resiliency. Water infrastructure is much more than bricks and mortar and pipes. It is also about data collection. All models are wrong. Some of them may be useful. There's room for improvement. Let's fund those as well. And then let's also enhance modeling methods and resources that could make our GAMs and WAMs better as well as our MAGs. Thank you much. Appreciate the opportunity. Right on time.